Hello and welcome to Unstress. My name is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I am recording this podcast, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I do this because we have so much to learn from our First Nations people about connection and respect for people and country. Weeks ago, I read an article in The Guardian which said that a low-salt diet would reduce heart disease and strokes by 20%. And I know that is wrong. And yet there it is, another piece of information in the mainstream media. I no longer call these news medias, but it is there. And when one explores the study and who is heads up the study, you realise that you don't have to dig too deep to find industry perpetuating a myth about public health that is just simply not good for the public health. Now, that may sound counterintuitive to many. Perhaps if you haven't listened to this podcast before, that may come as a surprise to you. But there are so many public health messages that demonise things like cholesterol, which is an integral part of every cell in our body, not to mention every hormone, about sunlight, for which there would be no life on Earth, and which we need a great deal of exposure to in moderation, but at the right time. The salt is another one, animal fats is another one. The list goes on and on and on. And so when I heard that salt was another issue, I immediately contacted my guest today, who I know has written a book on salt, has written actually 13 or 14 books on many other topics, including fats, on soy, on iodine, on B12, on statins, on arthritis, on hormones. My guest is Dr. David Brownstein, and David is a board-certified family physician. He's one of the foremost practitioners also of holistic medicine. In fact, he defines holistic medicine in this episode. He's the director of the Center for Holistic Medicine in West Bloomfield, Michigan, in the United States. David has lectured internationally to physicians and others about his success in using natural hormones, in using salt, in iodine, a whole lot of other nutritional therapies in his practice. He's a graduate of the University of Michigan and Wayne State University School of Medicine. He's also a member of the American Academy of Family Physicians and the American College for the Advancement of Medicine. Yes, David is a holistic practitioner. And I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did with Dr. David Brownstein. Welcome to the show, David.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Ron.
David, I recently read an article in the Guardian newspaper, and it said salt-free diet can reduce the risk of heart problems by 20%. It's a huge study done by the UK Biobank. And I just thought this is a controversy like so many others that we'll chat about today. But I just wondered when you read something like that, having written about it in your books, one of your many books, what do you think? What's your response to that?
Well, I've been practicing medicine for over 30 years. And when I started practicing medicine, I practiced as I was taught. I didn't vary. I didn't go into medicine to do anything different from the conventional realm of what I was taught. I didn't grow up in a household where we thought differently than whatever the doctor told us to do. When we went, we didn't go to the doctor much, but when we went, we didn't question anything. We took whatever he or she said to take, and that was it. So I went to med school to sort of model myself after my family doctor, and I never took a vitamin. I never questioned anything. Questioning things right after I was done and about 6 months into practicing medicine. And, the short version of that story is it's going to answer your question in a second. But
no, good. Because it leads to so many other questions. But keep going.
So I was practicing conventional medicine for 6 months after my residency, and I was doing what I was taught. I wasn't spending a lot of time with my patients. I was prescribing a lot of drugs. And first few months were okay. And then the next 3 months, I started to get this uneasy feeling. And around that time, my father was really sick with heart disease. And he was on 12 different medications for blood pressure and coronary artery disease and diabetes. And he looked like he was going to die at any moment. He was pale and pasty looking. He couldn't walk without popping nitroglycerin pills to control angina, which he's had continually for over 20 years. And we were all just waiting for the phone call that he had died. So I had that stress going on. And, I was practicing medicine. I was going to be a partner in this practice. And just, I went through a couple of nights, sleepless nights for some unknown reason, first time in my life. And I remember getting up and getting ready to go to work after a couple of those nights. And I tell my wife, I don't want to be a doctor anymore. I was 6 months into it. She's 7 months pregnant with our first child. And she's known me since I was 18 years old. And that's all I wanted to be, was a doctor. And she's like, what's wrong? Where's this coming from? I said, I don't know, but I can't do this for the next 30 years. I said, I'm not helping anyone. And all I'm doing is treating people with drugs that don't treat the underlying cause of the problem most of the time. And then I'm having to put them on more drugs because of the problems from the first drugs. And I said, I can't do this. I didn't think medicine was like this. And she said, well, why don't you do another residency? And I'm like, no, they're all the same. I'm not going to do that. And one was enough for that one. And so, I was floundering a little bit. And right around that time, this patient had been bothering me to meet his chiropractor. I didn't want to meet a chiropractor at that point. I didn't know what they did. I didn't know who they were, or philosophy or anything. I was just taught that chiropractors were bad and they were dangerous and, no one should refer to them. And you should tell your patients to not go to them. So in that anxiety, sleepless time, my patient, who happened to be a friend of mine, was telling me the chiropractor did more than just adjust him. He really helped him out, and he thought I should meet him. So, I did call the chiropractor at that time and set up a meeting for the following week. And the day comes around, and I tell my wife, I'm going to cancel this. When I got home from work, I said, I'm tired. I don't feel like going. And what's he going to, it's a waste of my time. So she said, that would be rude. You need to go, and told me to be nice on my way out the door. And I met him. He was a super nice guy. His name was Dr. Robert Radke. He was using functional nutrition in his practice, and he knew biochemistry way better than I did at that point. And I was blown away when he was talking about what he was treating his patients with and how they were doing. And, here I was newly minted out of med school and residency, and I couldn't quote a biochemical pathway to save my life at that point. So he brought me a book, Healing with Nutrition, written by Jonathan Wright, who's an allopathic physician. Took the book home, read it till 2:30 in the morning, called my dad in the office called my dad before I left work and told him, come in the office, I want to get some blood work. A few days later, I get his blood work back. I put him on two things, natural thyroid hormone and natural testosterone. No one had bothered to check his testosterone levels, which were below detectable limits, and his thyroid levels were in the lower part of the reference range. And once I put my dad on those two things, his 20-year history of angina melted away and never returned. A month later, his cholesterol, when I check it again, it's below 200 instead of the 300s without changing any of his bad dietary habits. He looked better. He was pink in the face instead of pale and pasty. He could do things without angina. Told me he was feeling so much better. Once I saw that, I'm like, that's what I want to do in medicine. Went to the partners and said, I need to leave. They said, why? And I'm like, I'm going to go do holistic medicine. What's that? I said, I don't know, but I'm going to have to figure it out. And they said, well, why don't you do it here? And I'm like, no, I need an office where everyone's on the same page and we're all people answering the phones and the chart people and the nurses. We're all under the same tent to do the same job, same goal. And, I left, and that's what I began doing. And so I started questioning everything at that point, everything. And any medical therapy, I decided I'd have to relook at because of what happened to my dad. I wasn't taught, and he was seeing the best doctors around. He was over-medicated. He was on 12 medications. I got him down to less than half of that, and most of the rest of them, doses were all lowered at least in half. And I started questioning everything. So, after treating my dad, everyone got a hormonal evaluation in my practice, particularly for the thyroid hormone. But one thing led to another, and I do remember where salt came in. So to answer your question about that article, which is a long-winded, hopefully not too long of a winded answer.
No. It's good, and it's opened up a whole can of worms.
So I start. Every patient gets tested for hormone levels and thyroid hormone levels, particularly since that's what I treated my dad with. And I start finding all these hypothyroid patients. I start researching why so many people hypothyroid. I stumble across iodine. I start testing people for iodine. Tested over 7,000 people now between me and my partners. And, over 96% are low, most significantly low in iodine. And then I was finishing up my iodine book. And, somewhere before this, I was using salt on people. And, I was taught in med school, salt's bad for you, raises blood pressure. There's nothing good about it. We get enough salt in our food. No one should ever use any additional salt in salting your food because it's going to give you high blood pressure. Well, when I started holistically looking at people and looking at their biochemistry and their physiology and their lab tests in a little more detail and correlating their lab tests with their biochemical function, what I was finding was people were low in salt. The vast majority of people didn't have enough salt in their body. So I started doing research on salt. I find out salt's the second major constituent in the body next to water. We can't live without salt. We have so many hormones and control and counter mechanisms to make sure our sodium and chloride levels stay within this tight little range. Because as soon as it falls out of that range, particularly the low part of the range, it rarely goes into the high part. People's bodies fall apart. Their whole, it's a mess when you're low in salt, particularly low in sodium, and it frequently happens in older people. It happens in people on diuretics. It happens in people who don't get enough salt in and start sweating. Either they get sick with a fever or they're exercising or it's hot outside or something like that. And it can be catastrophic. People die from hyponatremia all the time. Or they're at least hospitalized all the time. You can die from that. And I saw that when I was a resident in the hospital. So I was just using salt in my practice and successfully using it. People were feeling better. Their levels were better. I was finishing my iodine book, and I remember it. There was an article in our local newspaper on Thursday. It was on Tuesday, and it was a little health thing. And a dietitian had written the article. She wrote it every Thursday. I'd read the article, and as I got more and more in holistic medicine, I would find I was disagreeing with probably 95+% of what she was saying. But the question came in right at the end of my iodine book, finishing it, that said, is there any difference between unrefined sea salt and regular refined salt? And she said no. The answer was no. There's no difference. They're both too high in sodium, and you shouldn't use either product. So I remember I cut the article out. I pasted it over my computer screen, and it irritated me as I was finishing my iodine book, and I knew what my next book was going to be. So I wrote my book, Salt Your Way to Health. I don't think I have one handy with me.
It's all right. We're going to have links to it in the show notes.
And
I promise you.
Salt's been a huge part of my practice. My patients, if they're going to listen to this, they'll tell you I look at everybody's salt level at least twice a year. I comment to them all, many times you're too low in salt. You need more salt. There's a few people that are salt sensitive that can't take it, that might get elevated blood pressure with salt. They're few and far between, but they're out there. But I'm telling you, 99.9% of people can, if they have normal kidney function, can tolerate a lot of salt, and the kidneys will regulate what their salt level should be optimally when there's adequate amounts of salt coming in. So when I see articles like that, that's incongruent with what I'm seeing in my practice, I could tell you, after 30 years of practicing medicine, there's a few things I'm certain of, and salt is an important substance for the body. And there are some people that need to limit salt. If you have kidney failure, if you have congestive heart failure, sometimes those people can't regulate salt, particularly when they have kidney failure along with it. And if you have normal kidney function, the vast majority of people can handle huge amounts of salt. Now, I mean, no, more than I would recommend, but their kidneys could handle it and excrete the excess and still maintain adequate levels. So for populations populations don't do well where there's not enough salt in the diet. And the whole salt research is biased for basically keeping us in a low salt environment. And I think the reason for that is low salt levels lead to compensatory mechanisms in the kidneys and the adrenal glands, which release hormones such as aldosterone and renin and angiotensin that cause your blood pressure to go up. And we have a bunch of medications to tackle elevated levels of renin and angiotensin and kidney hormones and things like that are big sellers. And, we put a lot of people on that. And
well, I think you actually, when you say a low salt intake, ends up having a population that's not doing very well. And if the evidence is anything to go by, that kind of advice, along with a lot of other bits of advice like low fat, has kind of, if the evidence stands for anything, and I think the evidence is pretty clear, the population health is not doing really well, then something is wrong. It's so interesting to see the myth, though, perpetuated time and time and time again. I mean, I think you and I probably share a view of why that is so, and maybe I've just hit on it, that an unhealthy population is a great economic model, just not a very good health model.
Look, the best model for your big pharma is not to kill people because then you lose customers. Best is keep them sick, keep them chronically sick. They're going to need medication their whole life, and you make more money that way. And, you can keep people chronically sick by keeping them nutritionally deficient, hormonally deficient, and feed them bad food and convince them that bad food is good for them. And it's a perfect model for, selling your products. And
it's interesting, David, because when I saw UK Biobank, I wanted to learn a bit more about who they were, and it turned out that they are a government organisation, but it is headed by a guy by the name of Professor Rory Collins. And I'll just quote here who the head of this organisation is. You know him already, I know. He has led the largest trials in the world showing the benefits of statins and has also had funding from cholesterol-lowering drug manufacturers like AstraZeneca, Pfizer, Bristol Myers Squibb, Merck, Sanofi in other studies. And that was kind of, okay, now I get it.
He's from that cholesterol trialist, the CTT, right? Cholesterol trialist. There's another T in there. Isn't he from?
Well, it's the biggest world trial on the benefits of statin.
So
there is, and
the article I'm talking about. He wrote that article defending the use of statins, and then didn't publish the data behind the article. And that article cited all the time for why statins are beneficial, and yet you can't get the data to go through it. They won't release it. They just say they won't release it, and it's more nonsense. And
Yeah. But back to salt, and and actually we'll come to the holistic medicine in your journey, because I think that resonated with me. This is so similar to my own story, but in a different area. What salt should we be having? Not all salt is the same. When that person said, there's no difference between refined salt and the better quality salts, to me, that's an alarm bell which said this person clearly does not know what they are talking about. I remember hearing a PhD in dietitian saying that exact same thing, and they said, no, look, the only thing in the other salts, it's so minor that it's insignificant. And I went, don't we call that trace elements? Which tell us the difference between ordinary salt and what we should be having.
So when I started researching salt, I didn't know there was any difference. I would have told you the same thing that nutritionist wrote in that article, that all salt's bad for you. So I started researching salt, and what led me to it, when I started questioning everything, I started really looking at patients' their chemistry tests, and I'm noticing these lowered sodium levels. They're in the reference range. Reference range is like this, but they're down here in the reference range. And I'm like, is that right? Should people be down here in these salt? What's a normal? Just because it's a reference range doesn't mean it's a normal range. I mean, what's the optimal level salt should be? So I started doing some research on it, and I realized salt drives ATP production. You can't make energy molecules without salt. Sodium is necessary for proper blood pressure control. Your blood pressure is too low and you get dizzy, and you get orthostatic changes where you stand up and you get dizzy if the salt levels are too low. And so I decided I want to put people on salt. So I kind of look at the constituents of refined salt, which is a thin white stuff. It's white because companies make it white and they bleach it white because they think white looks more pure and more appealing to us as consumers. And it's got sodium and chloride, and then it's got ferrocyanide, aluminum silicates, and it's been bleached. Not a great product. So I'm like, what other kinds of salt are out there? And I start researching, and there's unrefined salt. So I started looking at unrefined salt. It has trace amounts of over 80 minerals. It doesn't have aluminum silicate in it. It doesn't have other things in it that salt shouldn't have in it. And I decided, there's some articles that are saying it's healthier to use this unrefined salt than refined salt that I found. I'm like, all right, I'll try this. And I started trying it. My patients did better. They got more energy. Leg cramps went away. That was a big thing that, tipped me off on what low salt levels are. And their brain fog got better. And, I started researching it more and then realized that, they've refined anything is not as good as any unrefined thing out there. The refining process is done so the product can stay on the shelves forever, and they take out all the living ingredients. Like you said, the products in salt, unrefined salt that are removed to make it refined salt, they call impurities in the salt literature. So the minerals, the magnesium, the potassium, the other things, they remove it and they call those impurities in salt. So unrefined salt's a much better choice. It's a much healthier choice. That's what I usually recommend. And there are versions out there that, I've tested a bunch of versions of them, and I find that, it improves my patient's health status. And, it's particularly when you're sick, you need to make sure salt levels stay up, because if you're sick with any viral, bacterial, parasitic illness, going into that illness with marginal salt levels, that's a disaster. That's what sends a lot of people to hospitals. The consequences of having low sodium levels, and then they get sick on top of that.
So do you suggest things like Himalayan rock salt or Celtic sea salt?
So I've tested Celtic. I've tested Salinas, Celtic salt, Himalayan salt, and Redmond salt 4 times for toxicity. They all tested clean. I think they're all 3 good products, and I think those are 3 pretty good products to use, and we use it all the time in our practice. And if you had any of my patients on, they would tell you that. If we measured the dry weight, for the major constituent in the human body is water. About 70% of the body is water, about 80% of the brain is water. The next major constituent is salt, sodium and chloride. We should have, we have huge amounts of sodium and chloride in our body for a reason, because we can't live without them. And to put someone on a low sodium diet or low salt diet for no particular reason it's beyond idiotic to me. When I see patients and they're complaining of leg cramps, they say, well, what's causing my leg cramp? I say, it's salt, period, salt deficiency, period, until proven otherwise. And, there's a couple other reasons you get leg cramps, but the vast majority of them are from low salt levels.
This is where, for us, where we are aware of perhaps conflicts of interest and where ego and ignorance often go hand in hand when it comes to practitioners. But for the public, being bombarded by this kind of a story in a reputable, I call it now media outlet, not news outlet, a media outlet, is really confusing, isn't it?
There's not too many reputable media outlets these days, and that's a problem. And I'm not sure there are any these days. So you got to be careful. Look, at this point, if we haven't taught ourselves, we should question everything. I don't know what's going to teach ourselves to do that, because the media can't be trusted right now, and you have to trust yourself, and you have to trust your own judgment here, and you have to educate yourself on this stuff. And that's why I started writing my books to, maybe a little selfishly make my life easier, so I wouldn't have to explain so much to my patients. And the selfish part of that was I needed patients on board with me that, be willing to follow me down this path. And I wanted them educated to do it. That's why I started writing the books, and I cite everything. And, I try and make it readable for both the physician and patient to get something out of it. And an educated patient is a better patient. And today's world, you have to educate yourself.
And David, just out of interest, when did you write that iodine book? Because it was the very first time I'd heard of you. I bought that book and read it. When was that?
It's in its 5th edition. And the first version was probably around early 2000s. And, that I kept doing updated editions to it because there was so much information. And, it's still the number one thing we do in our practice is correct iodine deficiency. It's the biggest bang for the buck that I see. And it helps more people in an inexpensive way than anything else that I do. And I've seen that for over 20 years.
Well, I know we've done a program on it many years ago where I learnt, surprisingly, that iodine deficiency is the biggest deficiency in the world.
Absolutely. And, it's a worldwide problem. Iodine levels have fallen over 50% in the United States over the last 50 years. You're in Australia, correct?
Yep.
I was in Australia. I don't remember how many years ago now, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And, I did some research on Australian levels. Australian iodine levels have also fallen and were very low. As a country, it's just similar to the U.S. And, in all the Western world's iodine levels are not great. And part of that is through the modern farming practices. They use these toxic halides in the soil, and it pushes out iodine in the food. And our iodine supply in our food has gone way down from pollution and pesticides and insecticides. And our food supply is lower in iodine. I can't quite speak to that in Australia because I can tell you what it is in the U.S., but I'll bet you it's a similar thing with all the refining of the food process.
Yes. So remind us why iodine is so important. You mentioned underactive thyroid, but remind us, give us iodine 101 and
quickly. Every cell in the body needs and requires iodine. It's an essential element we can't live without. And if it's deficient, it sets the stage for a host of problems. And since every cell in the body needs it, every cell in the body is going to be deficient and be reactive to that. So, if a pregnant mom is deficient in iodine, it can lead to low IQs of the baby, can lead to ADHD and autism symptoms. And, those are exploding across all the Western world right now. It can lead to thyroid problems, and it can lead to cancer problems of the glandular tissue, like cancer of the breast, prostate, ovaries, uterus, thyroid. In the U.S., thyroid cancer is the fastest growing cancer. Breast cancer affects 1 in 7 women. Prostate cancer affects 1 in 3 men. So it's been my premise that iodine deficiency is a great cause. It's a large piece of that pie, what's causing all those accelerated cancers in our modern world. We're not getting healthier over time in my country, and I know the same is happening in Australia too.
Yeah, no, the same
it's not happening. We're not getting healthier with all our, we don't have to fight the temperatures. We live in controlled environments. We got refrigerators. We can go to the store and buy food, which we have to hunt our food. We don't have to go hungry, and we're getting sicker, fatter, living less, living a shorter lifespan. And part of this issue is iodine deficiency. If there's one thing, if the powers that be came to me and said, we don't like your type of medicine, you have to stop doing all of it, go back to conventional medicine, but we'll give you one thing to take with you, it would be iodine.
Yes, I think I did this program with a professor of medicine quite a few years ago, Cresswell Eastman, in Sydney, and I asked him, do halogens, because we got chloride, iodine, bromide, fluoride, does fluoride compete with iodine in the thyroid gland?
Are you asking me?
Is there Yeah, I'm asking you, and I know what he said. I said, if you wanted to supplement the world with fluoride in the water or iodine, which would you choose?
What did he say?
And he said, no brainer. I mean, he said, of course, you'd supplement with iodine. But the question really is, can fluoride in the water supply displace iodine?
So fluoride, the iodine's in the periodic table of halides, group 17. So in those
Halides, okay,
halides, there's four of them: fluoride, bromide, chloride, and iodine. Two of those halides are essential. We can't live without them, which is chloride and iodine. And two are toxic and have no known therapeutic value in the human body: fluoride and bromide. The problem over the last 50 years in our Western world is we're getting too much fluoride and too much bromide. Now, you guys get less bromide than we do because there's some limits on it in your country. There's no limits here. Well, there's some limits, but we seem to get more bromide than you do. But fluoride is in our water supply. I don't think you have as fluoridated water supply as we have too.
No, we do. We do.
Oh, you do? I really thought.
And for our listener, I might just mention, if I'm right, that bromide is in fire retardants. Very common in
It's a fire retardant, and it's in carpets and curtains and mattresses and clothing, and in the U.S. it's in food. It's in drink. It's brominated vegetable oil and a lot of soft drinks. So we'd be, in my testing with my mentor in iodine, Dr. Guy Abraham, we would find high bromide levels and low iodine levels in patients. And if they were sick with one of the endocrine cancers, such as breast, ovaries, uterus, pancreas, prostate, thyroid, they would generally have more bromide and lower iodine than people that didn't have those diseases. And I did a study in my iodine book comparing, it was nine subjects with breast cancer. The next 9 people that came in the office, it's all I screened for, who had breast cancer. And the next 9, they were all women, of course, because men can get breast cancer too. But I did 9 women with breast cancer and 9 women without breast cancer, measured 24-hour iodine uptakes in iodine excretion tests at time 0, 24 hours, and 30 days. And everybody was low in iodine. The breast cancer patients were 50% lower than the non-breast cancer patients, and they were about 50% higher in bromide than the non-breast cancer patients. So, yes, the toxic halides can competitively inhibit iodine.
Yes, which for a not just under iodine food supply, but over fluoridated and brominated, it's a double whammy, isn't it?
That's exactly the term I use when I lecture. I call it a double whammy. It's just that you just described it perfectly.
So with iodine, if the foods haven't got it, or not many, well, where do we get it? And we need to supplement, obviously.
The highest amount of iodine in the world is in the oceans. So we can get it from ocean food and ocean vegetables. The problem is we polluted our oceans with halides, fluoride and bromide. So the same iodine uptake, it's called the sodium iodine transporter. I'm trying to think of a word. Same mechanism that we uptake iodine from our food via the sodium iodine transporter. And guess what you need to uptake iodine? You need an atom of sodium, 2 atoms of sodium for 1 atom of iodine to shuttle it into the body, into the glandular tissue. So you don't have enough salt, you can't take enough iodine in. But it's called the sodium iodine transporter. It's in humans, and it's in seaweed, and it's in fish, and it's in sea vegetables. It's in many things. And so if there's toxic halides, it overloads the system and it competitively inhibits iodine out of there where those things don't work. So even though the highest amount of iodine's in the oceans, if it's polluted, and it can be higher in bromide and or fluoride, causing more problems. And I think that's why iodine levels have fallen over the last 50 years in much of the Western world.
It's so interesting there. Opening up another can of worms here, because seafood is so often said, well, stay away from red meat, but have lots of seafood. And I used to be concerned about the mercury content in the larger fish and think the smaller fish were a better option. But now plastics, microplastics, not to mention fluoride and bromide, I hadn't included those, but it's a toxic soup out there.
And we've certainly met a mess of things, and that's why it's important to try to adopt a holistic lifestyle where you detox and where you exercise and where you try and get rid of some of these things, because it's really hard to avoid a lot of it these days.
Before I want to move on, I want to talk about holistic, but let's just finish with iodine and just say, What is some basic recommendation? I mean, obviously depends on levels and all of that, but what should the ordinary person, at least be having?
Well, it's different for different people, but
Yeah.
it's best to work with an iodine literate healthcare practitioner who can measure your levels and help you adjust your doses. And that's the best thing. But I will tell
Yeah.
you, the average iodine dose most of my patients are in 25 to 50 milligrams. And if they have glandular problems, that includes the breast, ovaries, uterus, prostate, pancreas, thyroid, sometimes more. If they have glandular cancer problems, they're on more. But for the average patient, 25 to 50 milligrams. And there are a few people, if they have an autonomously functioning nodule in their thyroid, they can run into problems with, once they take iodine, they make a lot of thyroid hormone and become hyperthyroid. I've only had a few patients over the decades with that. That can happen. That's why it's best to do this, under someone's, help and guidance that can, recognize that and just test for it and adjust things when it's needed.
It's so interesting, isn't it? Because this is what prompted me again. I just so grateful that you got on for us to have a chat about, because the salt issue is an example of so many other issues, like fluoride in the water supply, for example. One of the greatest public health moves, if you ask the dental community, they would say that, and I'm a dentist, so I know that it's heresy to even question this, but for all the reasons we've already, and there are other reasons as well, we could go into why that's not a good idea. But there are other ones like cholesterol, which we're on we're on a chat group that's been around for about 20 years online, the cholesterol skeptics. Cholesterol is another one, isn't it?
Again, when I started off, I wasn't questioning anything. Once I had my epiphany with my father, I started questioning every single thing out there. And look, physicians have, if you go back in time to the post-World War II, first decade or two after that, physicians were telling their patients to smoke cigarettes. It was okay to smoke cigarettes. It would calm you down. There's ads, ads here, what cigarettes doctors prefer most,
Yeah.
so medicine has been slow to change things over the years. And just because the herd is saying one thing doesn't necessarily make it right. And one of the ways that I usually judge when I think something's right or something's wrong is I look at the biochemical pathways and I start thinking, well, if this statin drug works by poisoning the HMG-CoA reductase enzyme, what is that going to do to the body? And I'll look at that pathway, see what's downstream from that. And once you look downstream from that, you see all these hormones and CoQ10 and some other essential metabolic items. It doesn't take rocket science to realize that cannot be a good thing to do for people. And no matter what the studies are showing at that time,
as in lowering cholesterol.
Yeah, poisoning that enzyme, it can't be useful for the vast majority of people. You look at the biochemical pathways, we should be supporting those pathways and optimizing those pathways, not poisoning them. So, that's kind of how I practice medicine now. And, look, I look at the studies and, I adjust things when new things come out. But I generally don't think it's a good idea to poison enzymes and block receptors, which is how 99% of drugs work. Now, having said that, do I use drugs in my practice to poison enzymes and block receptors? Absolutely. If you're in the middle of an acute heart attack or a stroke, guess what? You should use drugs to poison enzymes and block receptors because they've been proven to change the mortality rates for that. But the long-term use of those medications is another story for most conditions out there, and that's where there's been problems. But look, everything has its place, mostly. But I think we'd be better overall to be debating things, to questioning things, and to make those that support their ideas, answer to them. And, during COVID, there was a whole thing to stifle debates and de-platform and de-license people that question things.
Yeah.
That's not how I was taught in medical school. I remember my dean at medical school at a graduation told us, report your findings, good or bad, and report what you did right and what you did wrong so others can learn from you either way. And, that was fine and dandy until COVID, when all of a sudden you couldn't do that because the powers that be would, deplatform you and de-license you if you did that.
I was going to ask you, how you reflected on the pandemic, the response, and the lessons learned. I mean, the response, even for somebody who was always a little skeptical of the influence of big pharma on healthcare. I mean, this is a story
Well, you,
that is easy.
your,
Well,
your,
it's just
your country was a big, well, look, my country was a mess. Your country was a bigger mess. And you guys, man, you guys stifled debate. You made us look like nothing. And
yeah,
I couldn't believe that was happening in Australia. And you guys were the perfect petri dish for what happened, because you closed your borders and
yeah,
kept COVID away for a while. And then, you were the perfect case study for whether vaccines were working or not, because you guys got vaccinated before the virus even hit. And, look what happened. Nothing different happened. Everyone still gets sick and all that stuff.
yeah.
So, the worst thing we did during
Well,
COVID was stifle debate.
yeah, I read an article in the British Medical Journal in about April 2021, or maybe in 2022, talking about the influence of key opinion leaders and product champions. And I must say, in my observation, that those key opinion leaders and product champions occupied senior roles in health departments, both state and federal, in Australia, and regulatory bodies as well.
Same here.
So it was an amazing exercise. I mean, to me, the whole thing can be very easily explained in two words, and that is, it was a business model. And it was a bit opportune, it was an accident. I don't believe that it was purposefully started or anything like that. I think it was human incompetence in a laboratory that should never have been doing the research in the first place, but it was incompetence that leaked it. But the response was an incredible business model.
It'll be interesting 20 years from now, maybe 10 years from now, to when they start writing back about what we did during COVID. And, it'll be looked at as the dark days of medicine. And, the biggest boondoggle, the biggest, what's the word I want to use? I just used it in front of a patient earlier today. The biggest medical disaster of my career was watching this thing unfold. And, the fear they brought out to people, and how many people died from fear. I don't really know. It's what, this was really a viral infection, not that dissimilar from the flu. Although at the beginning, clearly people were having breathing problems, and I saw it and I treated people, and it was, look, I was scared too. I hadn't heard people breathe like this and seen pulse oxes like this as well. But this could have been easily managed by early treatment, I think, instead of telling people to stay at home till you can't breathe and then show up at the ER. And it was a disaster. It was a disaster of our own making. And I hope we learn from it, and hope we don't do it again.
Yes, I hope so too. Listen, you mentioned that 6 months after your graduation, you had this epiphany and moved into a whole new way of practicing. And you've mentioned the word holistic a few times, and I'm just interested because holistic means so many things to different people. What does holistic mean to you? Holistic medicine. What is holistic medicine?
Remember, so I go to my partners, who's my friend. He's my partner now. He actually left his practice and joined me later. But,
Right.
I said to him, hey, I want to go do holistic medicine. He goes, what's that? I'm like, I don't know, but I'm going to figure it out. So here I am 30 years later. I'm still figuring it out, but I do have a little better idea now. I think when I talk about holistic medicine, it's using the best of both alternative and conventional medicine, but it's looking at things that support the human biochemical pathways and human biochemistry and human physiology versus things that poison and block in the human body, such as drug therapies. So, things that support the human physiology and biochemistry include drinking water, salt, adequate amounts of salt, exercise, eating good food that's got nutrition in it that we can properly digest and take the nutrition and store it away for when we need it, versus eating refined food that has no nutrition in it, that we have to use our own nutritional items up to try and break this mess down, and then we become nutritionally deficient from that. So it's, what is holistic medicine? I think it's doing the things that support the human physiology and biochemistry and give it its best chance. And I think we were designed pretty darn well by our maker that if we just give the body its basic raw materials, it can do pretty cool things, even to old age. And it can also keep you healthy. And if you get sick with some kind of viral illness or new viral illness that perhaps escaped from a lab in Wuhan, China, that you can fight it back and recover from it like you should be able to. If we couldn't fight back from viral illnesses, we'd all be dead thousands of years ago. So that's what I think holistic medicine is today.
What's whole? I mean, it's a growing. I think there are more people moving into that area in medicine, but it's certainly a long way off being the majority. What's holding the majority back?
Well, I don't know if they're held back so much anymore. I mean, if COVID didn't wake people up, I don't know what will. And I think at least here, you could tell me, I'm sure it's the same mood over there, but everyone's irritated here. And they are irritated with the public health authorities. They've lost our trust. The CDC, which used to be the world leader, and the world looked up to the CDC and their recommendations, and they would jump in when there was a Ebola outbreak somewhere in Africa, and the world looked up to them, and that's gone now. They're going to have to work to get that back, and we'll see on that. And Ron, I forgot what your question was.
Well, what's holding them back?
Oh, so what's holding them back?
Majority back?
So I think a lot of people have learned they have to educate themselves, and what's holding them back a lot is fear. They try and make you fearful that you shouldn't have to think for yourself. We'll tell you what to do. Well, people are starting to question that. The more people to question it, the better we'll be. And there doesn't have to be that fear out there when you have enough education that you can take care of yourself and not rely on bad advice from what's coming from the powers that be out there.
Now, last thing I want to ask you just before we go, because I just wanted to come back to that original question about how much salt should we be having?
So, again, you should work with your holistic healthcare provider who is salt literate and salt knowledgeable. But generally, I tell patients who don't have kidney failure or heart failure about a teaspoon a day, give or take, of unrefined salt, in addition to what's already in food. So that's separate. And I have lots of patients who need more than that teaspoon. I put on a couple of teaspoons a day. But generally a teaspoon a day of unrefined salt beyond what's in food. And then sodium levels of around 141 milliequivalents per liter, and chloride levels of 103 milliequivalents per liter, or a little bit higher, are adequate, are optimal for those people.
David, thank you so much for joining me today. Your books are a great source of information, not just for practitioners, but for the public. Very readable, very so much information there, and we'll have links to all of those. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Ron. And let's I would tell the audience out there, question everything. Don't believe what I'm saying either. Take a look at what I've written, and then keep educating yourself. And we are literally unable to follow the powers that be recommendations blindly without thinking about it anymore. We saw what happened during COVID, and that's not a good thing. So that shouldn't happen again. But the information's out there. You have to educate yourself and find a holistic practitioner to work with. That's what I leave everybody with.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Well, we'll have links to David's website and his many books that he has written, which, as I said, the first book that I became aware of David would have to have been almost 20 years ago when I was exploring thyroid problems and iodine, and David's book was my first contact with him. And it's a great read, very accessible, both for practitioner and patient alike. So we'll have links to his website and those books in the show notes. I also want to remind you to join the Unstress Health community. As I have said, community is now more important than ever before. And as this episode reinforces, in advice that is focused on health, not on financial return, not industry funded, is more important today than ever before. And the Unstress Health community has some great resources. We have live events, regularly Q&As, where we will have guests, where we will be exploring specific topics. Many of those guests will be coming from our Unstress Health advisory panel, which is growing as we speak. But if you visit unstresshealth.com, you will access that, and I encourage you to do that. Until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Be well.
This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health, and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this podcast express their own opinions, experiences, and conclusions.